So, have you ever stopped to wonder if there's more to death than just being, a natural part of life? Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful and, for a lot of people, a pretty radical theological take on what life, death, and purpose are all about.
Yeah, death is just a natural part of life. It's a phrase we hear all the time, right? It's supposed to be comforting. But what if that common wisdom is just flat out wrong? The source material we're digging into today throws a huge challenge at that whole idea.
Okay, so let's jump right in by looking at what our source calls a fundamental misunderstanding. You could even call it a lie that we're often told about the very nature of death.
According to this text, death was never, ever supposed to be part of the original design. I love this analogy. A car wreck isn't part of the car's blueprint, right? Well, in the same way, death is presented here not as a natural feature of life, but as this destructive, invading enemy.
And this slide just lays out that conflict so clearly. This isn't some gentle cycle like the seasons changing. Nope. This frames life and death as total opposites. You've got the intended state versus the enemy. You've got what's natural versus an intruder, a gift versus a kind of bondage. They couldn't be more different.
So, okay, if death is the enemy, how do you defeat it? The source points us to this theological answer from the book of Hebrews. It argues that Christ's death wasn't a tragedy at all, but was actually a strategic move. The whole point was to destroy the power of death and to free all of us from the fear of it that can hold us captive our whole lives.
And this leads us straight to the Apostle Paul, who is a huge figure in this text. His view on this whole conflict between life and death is, well, it's deeply paradoxical. It almost sounds like a contradiction at first.
And there it is, the core idea that just stops you in your tracks. To die is gain. I mean, what a statement, right? How could the ultimate enemy, the very opposite of life, possibly be considered a gain? It doesn't seem to make any sense.
Well, to get our heads around this, we can't just look at death by itself. The key, according to the source, is figuring out what Paul valued even more than his own life. It all comes down to perspective, you know? It's about your priorities.
Now, this belief wasn't just some abstract idea for Paul. Not at all. It completely shaped his actions, his entire mission, and it allowed him to live a life that wasn't controlled by the fear of dying.
And this is absolutely crucial. Paul was totally ready to die, but his focus was never on his own survival. It was laser-focused on his mission. His confidence had nothing to do with living one more day and everything to do with the greater purpose he was serving.
His entire life was basically defined by these three goals. Everything, and I mean everything, including whether he lived or died, was seen through this lens. His life, his death, his letters, they were all just tools for a purpose that he believed was so much bigger than his own existence.
So, what does this extraordinary perspective from Paul mean for us today? How does looking at life and death this way actually change how we're supposed to live?
The source material doesn't try to sugarcoat this fact. It actually leans right into it. The reality that life is short isn't presented as something to be sad about, but as this incredibly powerful reason to live with intention, with urgency.
And that's really the big question the text leaves us with. If our time here is limited, what do we do with it? According to this viewpoint, the answer is all about making a very specific and very meaningful kind of impact.
And this is where the rubber meets the road. The source suggests we should focus on two main things. First, make the biggest possible impact for what it calls God's kingdom, which is basically about advancing a world of justice and peace. And second, actively work to bring people together, to encourage that unity of the faith.
So we're going to end with this final, really challenging thought, which comes from the very heart of this text. If you really truly believed this perspective, that death is a defeated enemy and not the final chapter, how would that change the purpose of your life? What is your life for?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the mind of a man on trial for his life. You'd think his top priority would be freedom, right? Or at least survival. But his actual goal was something else entirely, and it kind of challenges everything we think we know about winning.
So let's start with a quick thought experiment. Just imagine, for a second, you're in this situation. You're in prison, your life is hanging in the balance. What is the number one thing on your mind? Freedom? Proving your innocence? Just survival? Hold on to that thought, because we're about to meet a prisoner who saw things in a completely different light.
So the prisoner we're talking about is the Apostle Paul. He's locked up in Rome, waiting for a trial where the outcome could very, very easily be his own execution. I mean, the stakes literally could not have been higher.
Now, for you, for me, for pretty much anyone on the planet, the goal would be crystal clear. Get out. Do whatever it takes to prove your innocence, get released, and get your life back. It's just the most logical human response, right? But Paul, well, his perspective was on another level.
So what did winning look like for Paul in this situation? In a letter he actually wrote from that prison cell to his friends back in Philippi, he laid out his deepest hope. And trust me, it's probably not what you're expecting.
Just let that sink in for a minute. His number one goal, his earnest expectation, isn't his own survival. It's that Christ would be magnified, made to look great, honored, seen for who he is, through his situation. And get this part, he says whether by life or by death. His own fate was secondary.
And that brings us to this incredible contrast. On one side, you've got the priorities we would all expect. Get acquitted, survive, be free. But on the other side, you have Paul's stated priority, that Christ would be magnified, that God would be glorified, and that his life or death would be a powerful witness. For him, the entire definition of winning had been flipped on its head.
Now, to really get your head around this kind of mindset, you have to understand something crucial. This Roman imprisonment, this wasn't some shocking one-off event for Paul. This guy was, well, he was no stranger to suffering.
In fact, in another one of his letters, Paul actually rattles off a list of things he'd already been through. And when you see it, it just gives you this staggering context for his perspective there in that Roman cell.
I mean, just look at this. Beaten, stoned, shipwrecked, constantly in danger from every direction, often hungry, thirsty, cold. The man had already endured an almost unbelievable amount of hardship for his beliefs long before he ever ended up in that prison in Rome.
But, and this is the real kicker, just when you think you've understood the depth of his suffering, he reveals what he considered his true daily burden. And amazingly, it wasn't any of those things we just saw on the list.
And there it is. After listing off shipwrecks, beatings, and starvation, he says the thing that really weighs on him every single day is his concern for the communities of believers he'd helped start. His focus was never inward on his own pain. It was always outward on the well-being of others.
And this wasn't some kind of detached, professional duty. No, it was deeply personal. He used this incredible phrase, to spend and be spent, which basically means he was willing to pour out everything he had, his energy, his resources, his very life, for their spiritual health. That's why their success was a much bigger deal to him than his own physical safety.
Okay, so we see his internal mindset. But how did that actually play out in the real world? Well, it turns out his response to all this hardship became his most powerful message. The source material points out this really interesting paradox. Paul himself wrote that if you try to live a godly life, you're pretty much guaranteed to face some kind of opposition from the world. It seems the more your life looks like selfless love, the more friction you can run into.
But here's the twist. It's not the suffering itself that matters. It's the response to the suffering that becomes the testimony. Paul's unjust imprisonment wasn't the end of his mission. It just transformed his prison cell into a stage and his chains into a microphone.
And this quote just nails it perfectly. His attitude, his patience, his surprising cheerfulness, his courage, it all spoke way louder than any speech he could have given as a free man. His life was the sermon. So this story isn't just some dusty old history lesson. It actually leaves us with a really challenging thought that's just as relevant today as it was in ancient Rome.
And this is where the story becomes a mirror. The source material basically turns this whole idea back on us. It asks us to think about our own lives, specifically how we treat people. Not just our friends, but maybe especially the people who don't treat us so well.
And really, that's the ultimate question this whole explainer leaves us with. It challenges us to stop and think, what are our actions, our attitudes, our responses, especially when we're under pressure, communicating to the world around us? What is our life a sermon about?
Welcome! Today we're diving into a really powerful idea from the Apostle Paul. To die is gain. We're going to unpack what that means and how it ties into a spiritual battle that, according to our source, every single one of us is facing.
So let me just start by asking you this. Have you ever felt that? That push and pull in your life that seems to go way beyond just the daily grind? Well, this explainer gets right to the very heart of that feeling.
And that brings us to our first big idea.
an unseen cosmic struggle. The source we're looking at here suggests that those personal feelings of conflict are actually part of a much, much larger reality, something that's happening not just around us, but inside of us too.
And here it is, the core premise. The idea is that it's not just a personal problem or you having a bad day. The source says we are all, every one of us, part of something massive, what it calls a great controversy.
So what in the world is this great controversy? Well, it's defined as a cosmic spiritual struggle. It's raging all around us and deep within us. It's a conflict we're all going to experience in some way, shape, or form for our entire lives.
Now, if we're in this huge cosmic struggle, what kind of battle is it really? That takes us to our next section, which reframes this whole thing as a war of ideas. So you see, the battlefield isn't physical. It's somewhere else completely.
And this leads us to the central question, drawing from the book of 2 Corinthians. What's the basis of this spiritual war we're in, and what are our weapons? This question really sets the stage for understanding the true nature of this fight.
And here's the answer, and it is powerful. The most deadly spiritual weapons out there are ideas, both the good ones and the bad ones. The whole point is that this conflict isn't fought with swords and shields, but with thoughts, with concepts, with values.
So, if the weapons are ideas, what does that actually look like in practice? In this next section, we're going to look at the weapons we wield, and we'll compare the tools used on both sides of this spiritual conflict.
Just look at the difference here. It's pretty stark, right? On one side, you've got tools like criticism, betrayal, and fear, things that just tear people down. And on the other, you have weapons like love, mercy, peace, and kindness, things that build people up. The source is crystal clear that a believer should never, ever use the tools from that first column.
But even among all these positive weapons, there's one that is considered the most powerful of all, but only when it's used with real wisdom and care.
And that is the Word of God wielded by the Spirit. According to the source, this is the ultimate weapon. It's not about our own power or winning an argument. It's about the Spirit using this Word to let truth sink in and reach a person's heart directly.
Okay, I know this might all sound like a really difficult, even exhausting, lifelong struggle, but this is the moment where we get to the pivotal turning point of this whole discussion. Section 4, victory is already won, and this changes everything.
It all comes down to this absolutely incredible statement from the Apostle Paul. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. This one line completely reframes the entire meaning of the struggle and, honestly, the meaning of life and death itself.
So, what does that actually mean for us? Let's break down this victor's mindset. First off, the source says that Christ has already won the ultimate victory for us at the cross. Second, because of that, as long as we stay connected to Him, we can never truly be defeated. And finally, just like Paul, we can entrust our lives, our future, to a higher court, knowing the final verdict is already in our favor.
Okay, so if the victory is already won, how does that change the way we live right now? That brings us to our final section, living in that victory. This is where we get into some really practical steps for navigating this spiritual war.
So, how do we put this mindset into action? Well, the source gives us 3 steps. First, fight for what is right, not for your personal rights. That's a big one. Second, submit to God's will. And third, trust that higher court we were just talking about. It's a total shift in focus. And this really gets to the heart of that first step. See, it's not about the power dynamics the world is so obsessed with. It's not might makes right. Instead, the principle is that right makes might. Real strength comes from aligning yourself with what is right, with God's will.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In what ways are you actually experiencing this reality in your own life? And maybe more importantly, how can you draw real comfort and strength from knowing that, in the grand scheme of things, the victory is already won?
You know how sometimes you read a passage in the Bible, one you've maybe heard 100 times, and it seems super straightforward, but then you look a little closer and suddenly it's a real puzzle? Well, today we're going to dive into one of those moments. We're looking at a famous passage about life and death that might not mean what we've always thought it does.
Okay, so here's the puzzle. It comes from the book of Philippians. The Apostle Paul is writing, and he says he's torn, he's hard-pressed. On one side, he could keep on living, which would be good for the church. On the other side, he could die and be with Christ, which he says is far better. But hold on a second. Think about that. If dying meant you instantly go to a perfect paradise, would that really be a hard choice? I mean, why would he even hesitate?
Now, the way most of us have probably heard this explained is pretty simple. When a believer dies, their soul zips straight up to heaven to hang out with Jesus, right? It's an immediate reward. You go from all the suffering down here to total bliss up there. And honestly, for a long time, that's what almost everyone has thought this passage means.
But what if there's another way to look at it? There's this alternate view, and it's often called soul sleep. The idea, which pulls from other parts of the Bible like Ecclesiastes, is that the dead are, well, they're essentially unconscious. It's like a deep, dreamless sleep. They know nothing and are just resting, completely unaware of time passing until the day of resurrection.
So let's just put these two ideas right next to each other so we can see the difference. You've got the immediate heaven theory, where the soul is wide awake and having a great time in paradise from the moment of death. And then you have the sleep until resurrection idea, which says, nope, it's a state of unconscious rest until Jesus comes back. I mean, those are two totally different pictures of what happens after we die. And what's so fascinating is how Jesus himself talked about death. This is a huge clue. When his buddy Lazarus died, did Jesus say, "Hey guys, don't worry, Lazarus is having the time of his life in paradise right now"? No. He said, "Our friend Lazarus sleepeth." He literally uses the metaphor of sleep to describe death. That's a pretty powerful choice of words.
Okay, so let's just run with that popular immediate heaven idea for a minute. Let's do a little thought experiment. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. If that means he's been in a state of perfect, unimaginable, heavenly bliss for 4 straight days, what happens next?
This is where it just kind of falls apart logically. So picture Lazarus just experiencing pure joy. Then some angel shows up with what has to be the worst news ever. Hey Lazarus, sorry to interrupt, but you got to go back. Jesus is calling you back to a world with pain and sickness and where you're just going to have to die all over again. It just makes no sense, right? Calling someone out of paradise would feel more like a cruel act than a loving miracle.
Which brings us all the way back to our original puzzle with Paul. If he wasn't talking about an instant trip to heaven, then what on earth did he mean when he said departing to be with Christ was far better?
Well, according to this other interpretation, Paul's ultimate hope, the big prize that was far better, wasn't some in-between state. It was the finish line. It was the final resurrection. His goal, as he says elsewhere, was to attain to the resurrection from the dead. That's the moment when believers are truly, completely, and physically with Christ. Okay, and this is where it gets really mind-bending, especially when you think about it from a personal point of view. If the dead are unconscious, if they're in that dreamless sleep, what's their experience of time like? So just imagine the gap between the moment you close your eyes in death
And the moment of the resurrection. To the person who has died, that time is zero. Nothing. There's no sense of waiting for years or centuries to go by. It's instantaneous. You close your eyes in death, and in what feels like the very next split second, the twinkling of an eye, you're seeing Jesus return.
So here's the key takeaway, the big aha moment. From your own conscious perspective, there is no gap. The very next thing you will be aware of after you die is the glory of the second coming. So for Paul, departing meant that his very next conscious thought would be seeing his Savior face to face, and that is why it was far better.
And so I'll leave you with this to think about. If you knew for an absolute fact that your very next conscious moment would be the return of Christ, how would that change the way you look at life and death? And how does that help you understand why Paul was so hard-pressed, torn between two really amazing options? It's definitely something to chew on. You know, we talk a lot about unity, right? But what if I told you it was at the very heart of one of the most intense, urgent prayers ever recorded? That's what we're going to dig into today, this incredible prayer and what it really means for you and me. And boom, here it is. This one line is the key to everything we're talking about. It comes from this really personal final prayer, a plea for his followers. And the bar for this unity, it's set incredibly high. We're not just talking about, being nice to each other. The goal is to reflect the very nature of God himself.
Wow. Okay, so let's just paint a picture here for a second. Think about it. In his absolute final moments, right before this unimaginable ordeal, Jesus isn't focused on himself. Not at all. He's looking forward, past the cross, dreaming of a future where all of us are united with him and with the Father. It was so much more than just saving us. It was an invitation, an invitation into a divine family.
But here's the thing. This prayer, it wasn't just some private, quiet wish. No way. It has huge, real-world consequences. And why is that? It's simple, really. The world is watching. And whether we're unified or not, well, that sends a message, a really powerful one.
And this right here just lays it all out, doesn't it? It's so clear. Not once, but twice, Jesus ties our unity directly to whether the world can believe. Think about that. When we're one, we're like this living, breathing proof. But when we're divided, we actually become a reason for people not to believe. I mean, that's a heavy thought, right?
Okay, so the big question is, how on earth do we actually do this? How do we get to this kind of unity that seems, let's be honest, kind of impossible? Well, the answer starts with a total shift in how we see ourselves, a complete change in our identity and where we belong. And it all comes down to this one single Greek word. Get ready for it: politeuomai. So when the Apostle Paul writes, "Let your conduct be worthy," he's not just saying, behave yourselves. The word he uses is so much richer. It literally means to live as a citizen. And he's not talking about being a citizen of Rome or whatever. He's telling us to live our everyday lives as if we're citizens of heaven, to bring the culture and the rules of that kingdom down here to earth. It's a game changer.
So what does that look like day to day? Well, here you go. This is what living as a citizen of heaven actually looks like in practice. All these ideas come straight from the Sermon on the Mount, which is basically Jesus laying out the Constitution for his kingdom. And this isn't just a nice little list of good things to do. Oh no. It's a full-on challenge to the way the world usually works, you know? That whole me first, climb the ladder culture. Instead of all that, this is a call to a totally different way of being. One that's all about mercy and peace, and yeah, even loving the people who were against you.
And you know, this verse from Micah just sums it all up perfectly. It's so simple, but man, is it deep. Do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. That's it. That's the blueprint. That's the foundation for a life that leads to unity.
So if the blueprint is that clear, why is this so hard? Why do we struggle so much with it? The answer, and this is where it gets real, isn't found out there. It's found inside, in the battle that's going on in our own hearts.
I mean, you'd think it would be tough to get angry with someone who's just living like that, right? Someone who is genuinely meek and merciful and a peacemaker. Who could have a problem with that? And yet, we know it's not that simple, is it? So what gives? What's really happening under the surface?
All right, let's just be honest for a second. We've all done this. Sometimes when you see someone else being too good, it kind of shines a spotlight on our own stuff, on our insecurities. And what do? We might start some gossip about them, or we try to find their flaws just to make ourselves feel a little better. You know what I'm talking about. In those tiny moments, we're actually choosing division over unity, all to protect our own ego. And that right there is where disunity starts.
And this quote just nails it. It gets right to the core of the problem. When we let pride and that what's in it for me ambition take over, there's no room left for a spirit of unity. It gets pushed right out. And what fills that space? Division, conflict, strife. It's like a poison that weakens the whole community.
Okay, so we've identified the problem, the real root cause, but the really good news is that there's an antidote. There's a cure for this poison of pride. And it's something incredibly powerful, but also beautifully simple: humility.
So you see, the path forward isn't some complicated formula or self-help program. It's a person. It's all about looking to the example Jesus gave us. It's about trying in our own messy lives to grab hold of that same humility, that same meekness. That's where the real power is. That's the strength we need to beat the pride that just loves to tear us apart.
So I'm just going to leave you with this question to chew on. What would it look like, really, if we all took this seriously? What if we all actually started living like we were citizens of heaven, but right here, right now? Can you even imagine the difference that would make? What a different church, what a different world we would have. Just think about that, because at the end of the day, the choice is up to us.
So, what's the real connection between being united and being courageous? In this explainer, we're going to dive into a text called United and Fearless to unpack a really powerful idea that true unity, well, it's not just about playing nice. It's actually the key to conquering fear and finding real hope, even when life has you feeling like you're right on the edge. Right out of the gate, the source material hits you with a gut punch. Disunity is deadly. Wow. No gentle intro, no easing into it. This isn't just some abstract idea. The text is framing this as a matter of spiritual life and death. literally from the very first sentence. All right, so to really get why disunity is so dangerous, the text first digs into the core problem. It calls this first section a house divided. So the source basically sets this up as a huge conflict of strategies. On one side, you've got that classic tactic of divide and conquer, which it pins on Satan. And on the other side, you have the principle of a house united, a core teaching from Jesus. This isn't just a minor disagreement. It's a battle between two totally opposite ways of seeing the world. And to really hammer this point home, the text points us to Mark chapter 3. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. I mean, just think about that for a second. Unity isn't just some nice little bonus. What the source is arguing here is that it's the actual foundation. Without it, the whole structure is just doomed to collapse. Okay, so if disunity is the fatal problem, what's the solution? Well, the source material offers a pretty clear answer in our next section, which it calls the 3 keys to unity. The source lays out this really powerful 3-part formula. First, you need a shared mission, right? Everybody has to be rowing in the exact same direction. Then you need a common message. You've got to be telling the same story, all based on the same truth. And finally, number 3 is intentional unity. And this is key. This isn't something that just magically happens. It's a conscious choice, a constant effort to stick together. And here is the absolute crucial insight. These 3 keys are totally dependent on each other. The source is emphatic about this. You can't just pick 1 or 2 that you like. The mission, the message, and the unity, they're a package deal. They either all stand together or they all fall apart. So, what happens when these 3 keys actually click into place? Well, the source argues it unlocks something incredibly powerful. And that brings us to section 3, the power of fearlessness. But that brings up a huge question. How exactly does having a shared mission and message make a group of people fearless? Right? How does having your internal house in order protect you from all the threats on the outside? The text's answer here is pretty bold. It argues that when a group is truly deeply unified, any opposition becomes, and I'm quoting here, powerless to stop the onward march of God's truth. It's almost like that unity creates this kind of unstoppable spiritual momentum, a force that just can't be held back. And this idea is backed up by this powerful promise from Philippians that we need not be in any way terrified. So the big takeaway here isn't just about being strong, it's about being free from fear. That unity becomes this kind of spiritual and psychological shield against whatever threats you might be facing. But it's not just about external opposition, is it? The source then pivots to a challenge that's, well, universal to all of us, suffering. And it frames this tough reality with a pretty stark image in section 4, life on a precipice. Yeah, the text does not sugarcoat reality at all. It points to figures like Job to make it crystal clear that life in this world can be really hard. It states it plainly. Suffering, to some degree, is the lot of us all. This isn't some abstract theological concept. It's a direct acknowledgement of a painful, shared human experience. But the source doesn't just leave us there, in the reality of suffering. It pushes us to look deeper, to find a pattern, basically asking, when you look across all of Scripture, what is the common theme that starts to emerge from all this pain? And the text pulls together an answer from passages all over the place: Matthew, Acts, Romans, 2 Timothy. And a really specific theme comes into focus. There's a huge difference between the random hardships of life and the unique kind of suffering that comes from actively standing for your faith. One is just, bad luck. The other, the source argues, is purposeful. And that crucial distinction, that is what leads us to our final section, where this entire argument really comes together. The source presents this final thought as suffering for a reason. And so everything we've been talking about builds to this one ultimate question. What hope and what comfort can possibly be found in the middle of our suffering? I mean, when you get right down to it, this is the question that truly matters. The answer given is a complete reframing of the whole idea of suffering. The text concludes that it's better to suffer for Christ's sake than for anything else. The core idea here is that suffering for a reason, for a purpose that you deeply believe in, it completely transforms the experience. It gives hardship a meaning that random, pointless pain can never have. So we'll leave you with this final, powerful question from the text, found in 1 Peter. And who is he who will harm you if you become followers of what is good? It's a question that really forces you to redefine what harm even means. It suggests that when we're united for a good cause, we might just become untouchable in the only way that truly matters. A powerful thought to reflect on.
Why do we suffer? I mean, really, why is there so much division even among people who are supposed to be united by faith? And in the middle of all that, how are we supposed to trust? These are, some of the biggest questions we face. So today, we're going to dig into one specific theological framework that tries to answer them, pulling our insights straight from the source material. Let's just start right here with this, it's a powerful and, frankly, a pretty unsettling quote. It paints a picture of the absolute worst kinds of human suffering you can imagine: torture, imprisonment, death. And yet what comes out of that isn't a scream of pain, but a shout of triumph. How is that even possible? That paradox, right there, is the core question we're going to be unpacking. So, that brings us to our first big idea here, a shout of triumph. We're going to explore how the source material explains this incredible resilience, how a really deep faith can not only survive, but actually seem to triumph, even when facing unimaginable hardship.
And here's the question the source material puts right at the center of it all. I mean, just look at these words: destitute, afflicted, tormented. We're not talking about small, everyday problems. So how can someone in that situation still say with total certainty, "I know whom I have believed"? That's the profound mystery we're diving into.
But the struggle isn't just a personal one. The source material argues that right alongside this internal battle with suffering, there's a collective, external one, what it calls the challenge of disunity.
And this quote right here, from R.F. Cottrell, this is where we pivot a little bit. See, it's not about persecution from the outside, but division on the inside. His observation is that the world of faith has never been more fragmented, which presents a completely different kind of challenge.
The key phrase here is that great diversity of faith. And, the source isn't just talking about different denominations or small disagreements. It's suggesting something much deeper, that the very foundations of belief have fractured, and that's leading to some really fundamental disunity.
So, after diagnosing that problem, the text presents a really clear, really ambitious goal, a call to restore that unity. But you have to ask, right? If the problem is a historic level of diversity, how could you possibly achieve that? Well, the source material actually points us back to the early Christian church as a kind of model. It argues that unity was held together through what it calls spiritual gifts, these specific roles you see here. The thinking is, if these were necessary to preserve unity back then, well, they're even more essential to restore it now.
This whole idea of internal fragmentation, it brings up an even bigger question. If a community of faith is supposed to be a source of strength, what does it mean when that community is itself broken? That lack of unity can feel like its own kind of suffering, which brings us right back around to that huge, universal question that hangs over everything.
All right, so to even try to tackle a question that immense, you need some kind of model, a way to make sense of the chaos. And the source material provides just that. It calls it a framework for suffering.
And at the very heart of this framework is a concept called the Great Controversy motif. Now, this is a specific theological worldview that basically reframes everything we experience. It suggests that the suffering we see and feel isn't just random chance, but is actually a visible piece of a much larger, invisible cosmic battle between good and evil.
Now look, the source is really clear on this. This isn't meant to be some simple answer that just neatly explains away every single tragedy. It's offered more like a lens, a way of looking at a broken world to try and find a pattern, to provide some kind of understanding for what is, let's be honest, a terrible reality. For believers, its power is in giving some meaning to the chaos.
Okay, so once you have this framework, this lens, the source material then uses it to approach some of those other really tough questions that we often find ourselves searching for answers to.
For example, what happens when we die? The source contrasts a very common belief that believers go straight to heaven with its own view, which is that the biblical answer is actually way more nuanced and needs to be explained very carefully. This is a perfect example of that great diversity of faith we were just talking about.
And that brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to the problem of disunity. If this bigger cosmic conflict is the backdrop for everything, how does that change what we do right here, right now? The source asks it directly. What does it take for the Holy Spirit to bring unity into the church today?
And this slide lays out the path forward that it proposes. It's a two-part answer. First, the work of the Holy Spirit is seen as the absolute foundation. You can't do anything without it. And second, it calls for action, actually putting into practice the advice believed to come from this gift of prophecy.
But here's the thing. Even with a framework for suffering and a proposed path to unity, the source acknowledges that intellectual answers, well, they only get you so far. And this brings us to its final, most important argument, the need to trust in an ultimate answer.
And this is a really honest moment in the text. It basically admits that no system, no matter how well thought out, can fully take away the pain of suffering. Some questions are always going to remain. So, what do you do then?
So when the why questions just don't cut it anymore, the source shifts our focus from an explanation to a person. It suggests the ultimate answer isn't a what or a why, but a who. The path it lays out is to look at the cross not just as a historical event, but as the ultimate expression of love right in the middle of suffering. And from that vantage point, it suggests you can learn to trust, even when absolutely nothing else makes sense.
This phrase really is the heart of the whole thing. When you're faced with suffering that you just can't explain, the answer presented here isn't a better argument, it's an event. It's what the source calls the fullest expression of love, and it's offered as the anchor in the storm of all our unanswered questions.
And that leaves us with the final, summarizing question that this whole exploration has been building toward. When you're confronted with pain you can't understand and divisions you can't seem to heal, in the worst of times, where do we find our trust? According to this source, the answer isn't in knowing everything, but in knowing who you have believed.
Today, we're diving into an incredible story from Bangalore, India. It's all about an unexpected threat and an even more unexpected solution. Let's get into peacocks to the rescue. So let's just start with the question at the very heart of this story. What do you do when a place that's supposed to be a safe haven, a place built to protect children, suddenly becomes the source of a terrifying danger? Okay, so our story is set at the Sunshine Children's Home, run by its director, Beulah Fernandez. Now, this place was designed to be a total sanctuary, but that feeling of peace was about to be shattered by a silent, slithering threat. So what was this threat? Well, it was an outbreak of baby cobras all across the campus. And you can imagine, Beulah was absolutely terrified. This was a serious problem that they could not ignore. You see, the stakes here were terrifyingly high. This wasn't just some abstract fear. Just 5 years before, a boy on campus had actually been bitten by a cobra. He survived, thankfully, but only after a whole year of grueling treatments and multiple surgeries. That memory was still incredibly fresh. And this time, the snakes were just everywhere. I mean, across the whole 10-acre campus, they were seen on the roads, in the gardens, hiding under cars, and get this, one was even found right outside Director Beulah's front door. The threat felt completely inescapable. You can just feel the desperation in her prayer. It really shows the immense weight on her shoulders, feeling so powerless to protect the very children she was responsible for. So, of course, they did the logical thing, right? They called in professional snake catchers. But here's the problem. These guys were used to apartments and confined city buildings. A big, lush, 10-acre campus? It was just too difficult, and they couldn't find the baby cobras. So, with the experts stumped and the danger still very, very real, the whole community, I'm talking staff members and even the kids, they just started to pray, hoping for any kind of help. And then, just when things felt pretty hopeless, something really strange happened, something that nobody could have ever seen coming. A staff member saw it first, a single peacock. Now you have to understand, this was just wild. A peacock here, on their campus, right in the middle of a huge city like Bangalore, it made no sense at all. And then, as if that wasn't strange enough, a little while later, a second one appeared. So now everyone's wondering, what on earth are these beautiful birds doing here? And here, right here, is the key to this whole thing. See, peacocks aren't just for show. A big part of their diet? Snakes, including, you guessed it, venomous cobras. So a couple of evenings later, the staff and kids get to see this just incredible scene. There they are, the two birds, a peacock and his counterpart, a peahen, just strutting majestically around the garden. And everyone watched as the male fanned out his brilliant eye-marked tail in this stunning display. And believe it or not, that was the turning point. After that incredible display, the baby cobras were just gone. I don't mean a few of them, I mean all of them. They had completely vanished from the campus. I mean, It's almost too simple to believe, right? Step 1, the peacocks show up. Step 2, the cobras disappear. The connection just felt, well, undeniable. And the craziest part? Even after their job was done, the birds stuck around. The peacock and peahen just stayed on campus, almost like these beautiful, stately guardians watching over the place. Yeah, they became this amazing part of daily life at the home. Even now, you'll hear someone shout peacock pretty much every day, and all the kids just come running out to catch a glimpse of them. So for Beulah Fernandez and everyone there, the explanation was simple. As she puts it, we believe that God sent the peacocks. For them, it was a direct answer to all those prayers. And just to give you some perspective on how unbelievable this was, think about it. The Sunshine Children's Home has been around for 45 years. You know how many times a peacock had been seen on campus before this whole thing? 0. Not a single time. You know, Beulah's final reflection really just captures the heart of this entire story. This idea that solutions to our biggest problems can show up in the most beautiful and unexpected ways. And that really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? It kind of makes you wonder, in our own lives, when we're facing problems that seem impossible, where might these beautiful, unexpected solutions be hiding if we just keep our eyes open for them? All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to explore a worldview that pretty much flips everything we think we know about life and death on its head. It's a perspective where the end is actually the beginning, and life is driven by one single, all-consuming purpose. So let's start with this. This is a powerful, much more modern quote from Martin Luther King Jr. Think about that for a second. To be truly fit to live, you need a purpose you are willing to die for. Wow. That sets an incredibly high bar for what a meaningful life looks like. It's a heavy concept for sure. So that's the question, right? What on earth could inspire that kind of conviction? What belief system could possibly make someone not just face death, but actually see it as part of their purpose? Well, it turns out this is not a new question at all. There's a much older, more foundational statement that really gets to the very heart of this idea. And here it is. This is from the Apostle Paul. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Okay, so the first part, to live is Christ, you can kind of wrap your head around that in a religious context. But that second part, it's staggering. To die is gain. Wait, what? How is that even possible? That's the paradox we're going to unpack today. All right, let's break this down piece by piece. We're going to start with that first half. To live is Christ. What does it actually mean to be so focused on a mission that your own identity, your own life, almost takes a backseat? Now, the first thing you have to get is that for Paul, this wasn't just some nice-sounding abstract philosophy. The source material makes it crystal clear that this statement was a literal description of his life. It wasn't just an idea he had, it was his actual, day-to-day, lived reality. And you can see just how deep this commitment went in his own words. I mean, listen to this. I have been crucified with Christ. It's this wild idea of a complete identity switch. His personal wants and needs, they're not the driving force anymore. His mission is the driving force, and it's living through him. And look, this had very real life-or-death consequences. He lived by this faith, even seeing himself as a sheep for the slaughter for his cause. And in the end, he was actually executed for these beliefs. He didn't just talk the talk, he lived and literally died by this commitment. Okay, so that kind of covers the living part. But now we've got to face the most challenging piece of this whole puzzle. How could dying, the end, possibly be considered a game? I mean, this just goes against every instinct we have, right? We fight death, we fear it, we see it as the ultimate loss. So how in the world do you get from that to gain? Well, the answer lies in completely reframing what death even is. The key, the real game changer in this whole worldview, is a redefinition of death. In this way of thinking, death isn't the final stop. It's more like sleep. It's just a temporary unconscious pause before a final future awakening. It's not the end. It's more like hitting pause. And this is a super important distinction to make. The hope here is not what we usually think of as the immortality of the soul. You know, the idea that your spirit just kind of floats off somewhere when you die. No, the hope is in the future resurrection of the body. It's seen as a physical event that brings you back to life. So if you believe that, and death is just sleep before that big event, it completely loses its power, its finality. So you've got this radical individual commitment, and it's all built on this idea that death has basically been defanged. But here's the thing. This powerful personal conviction, it was never meant to be a solo act. It was meant to fuel a collective mission. Yeah, the point wasn't to create a bunch of lone heroes. The whole vision was to take that individual fearlessness and transform it into collective action. The purpose that was worth dying for was a purpose that had to be fought for together as a whole community. And this mission is framed as a kind of spiritual war. And in this view, to win that war, you need two things. First, you've got to use the right spiritual weapons. But just as importantly, you have to fight together, in unity. The real strength comes from the group, not just the individual. So let's just put it all together, because you can really see the logic when you lay it out. Step 1, total all-in commitment to a mission. Step 2, that commitment is possible because you redefine death as just a temporary pause. And step 3, you channel that fearlessness into a unified, collective fight. See? Each step builds right on top of the one before it. And this is really the core takeaway here. When you combine a singular, all-consuming purpose with the belief that death isn't really the end, well, all the old rules of risk and fear and failure, they just go right out the window. It creates a whole new logic for how to live. So that leaves us with a pretty massive question for our own lives, doesn't it? In a world that is pulling us in a million different directions, what does it even mean to find a purpose that profound, what is worth living for, and maybe even dying for? It's a challenging thought.
Today, we're going to break down one of the most puzzling and honestly one of the most profound statements ever made. For to me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Now, the Apostle Paul wrote this from a prison cell, possibly facing his own execution. So what on earth could he mean by seeing death as a gain? That's what we're going to unpack. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll start with the story of a man who literally died for this belief. Then we'll dig into the paradox itself. We're going to unpack the original language, which is super important here. We'll also look at a common idea about death. And finally, we'll see why this ancient concept is actually all about how we live together right now.
To really get a feel for the power of this idea, we're not starting with theology. We're starting with a person, a man named John Bradford, whose entire life and death was completely shaped by this one sense.
Imagine this. It's July 1st, 1555, in England. A popular preacher named John Bradford, who was chaplain to King Edward VI, is being taken to be burned at the stake. And as the wagon carries him to his death, these are the words he shouts for everyone to hear.
It's an incredibly dramatic moment, right? And it just goes to show you how deeply Paul's ancient words have echoed through history, inspiring this level of devotion. A devotion that sees death not as the ultimate end, but as something else entirely. Okay, so let's get right to the source of this whole idea. Let's look at the puzzle Paul lays out for us in his letter to the church in Philippi.
And here it is, the famous line. Now, on the surface, this seems to flip everything we know about life and death completely upside down. Living is for a purpose, sure, but dying is somehow better? How does that work?
And that, right there, is the central puzzle, isn't it? How can the ultimate loss, death, how can that possibly be framed as a personal gain?
This really lays out the tension Paul was feeling. He knew that to keep on living meant he'd have to endure all kinds of hardships for his cause. And yet, he presents dying as the better option, the more profitable outcome. It's a genuine puzzle.
To solve this, we have to do a little digging. And the key to unlocking this whole thing, it's all in the original Greek word Paul used for gain. So the first way to look at it is through the noun kurdos, which basically means gain or profit. For Paul, everything he used to value, his reputation, his achievements, he now saw all of that as a total loss. Why? Because the real profit, the ultimate kurdos, was knowing Christ. That was the only thing on the balance sheet that mattered.
But wait, there's another layer here. The verb form, kurdanoo, means to gain or win. And Paul uses this word all the time in a missionary sense. He talks about trying to win people over to his faith. And this is where it all clicks into place. How could his own death be a strategic victory? Well, Paul believed his death would be the most powerful sermon he could ever preach. The courage of a martyr could touch people's hearts, it could give other believers courage, and it would be the ultimate final act of his life's mission, a final powerful way of winning people to the cause. Okay,
But this brings up another huge question, right? If death is gain because you get to be with Christ, does that mean it happens instantly? Like one moment you're here, the next you're consciously in some afterlife? Well, Paul's own words actually point to something a little different.
It turns out both Jesus and Paul consistently use a very specific metaphor for death: sleep. When Jesus was told the young girl had just died, this was his response. And you can imagine it really confused the people around him.
And here's the key part. Luke, the author of this account, makes sure to tell us that the crowd laughed at him because they knew she was physically dead. So Jesus wasn't being literal. He was describing death as a state of temporary unconsciousness, like a deep sleep.
And you see this idea pop up all over the place. Stephen, the very first Christian martyr, is described as having fallen asleep. Same thing is said about King David and the early patriarchs. So from this point of view, death isn't a trip to another dimension. It's a quiet, unconscious rest where your next conscious thought is the resurrection.
All right, for our last section, let's bring it all together. Because this radical view of life and death was never just some abstract philosophical idea for Paul. It had a very urgent, very practical purpose for the community, for the people living right here and now.
It's amazing, really. After talking about his own potential death, he just pivots. He doesn't dwell on it. Instead, he immediately turns his focus to the Philippians, and he urges them to stand firm together, united in one spirit and one mind, as they face their own challenges.
And he really hammers this point home. He uses a whole series of powerful Greek words that all start with the little prefix sin, which means with or together with. He talks about being a yoke fellow, taking things on together, struggling along with each other, being fellow workers. You get the picture. It's all about togetherness.
And that right there is the heart of it. Paul's willingness to die was rooted in a perspective that made the mission way bigger than his own life. And he called the people in Philippi to have that same perspective, because that kind of unity, that powerful shared purpose, is what makes the mission possible in the first place.
And so, this ancient text leaves us with a pretty tough question, one that's just as relevant today. Paul believed that a radical view of our own lives and deaths should fuel a radical commitment to unity. So if togetherness for a common cause is the goal, what is it in our own lives and communities that keeps us apart?
Have you ever thought about how sometimes the hardest things in life are also the most meaningful? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're exploring the path of a disciple, a journey defined by two really powerful and honestly contrasting symbols, the cross and the crown. So what does that actually look like? Let's get into it. Right off the bat, the whole idea is anchored in this core teaching from Jesus himself. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. Seriously, this one line is the key to understanding everything else. It sets up this powerful idea that a follower's journey is pretty much destined to look a lot like their leaders. All right, so here's our game plan for unpacking all of this. First, we're going to face the reality of the disciples' difficult path. Then we'll get into the unseen battle that explains why it's so tough. After that, we'll look at the call to mission, what you're supposed to do about it. And finally, we'll land on the eternal reward. Okay, let's jump into section 1. This is all about that difficult path, and the source material makes it clear this isn't just a possibility, it's an inescapable part of the deal. And, this idea of a shared experience is incredibly consistent. Jesus makes it even more plain, saying, if they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. I mean, the message couldn't be clearer, right? Opposition isn't a maybe, it's a guarantee. So this redefines what we even mean by discipleship. It's not just about learning, it's a path that by its very nature includes rejection, suffering, and hardship. And why? Because it's all about mirroring the teacher's experience. The follower's journey is completely tied to the path the leader already walked. So you're probably asking the big question, why? Why does it have to be so difficult? And the source gives us a really profound answer by pulling back the curtain on what it calls the unseen battle, this huge cosmic conflict happening just out of our sight. The source material, drawing from the Apostle Paul, totally reframes what this fight is about. You can see it here. The struggle isn't with flesh and blood, other people. Nope. The real battle is against spiritual hosts of wickedness. And that one idea just changes everything. It means the opposition you face isn't just personal, it's part of a much bigger, invisible war. Then, the source actually names the bad guy in this cosmic drama, Satan. And it says he's working like crazy to stop the gospel from spreading. But here's the kicker. His motivation? He's acting with such urgency because he knows that he has a short time. That little detail just amps up the intensity of the whole situation, doesn't it? So, if you've got this difficult path and this unseen battle, what in the world are you supposed to do? Well, that brings us to the call to mission. This isn't about just sitting back and surviving. It's a command to endure and to act. And the source lays out a really clear 3-part game plan. It all starts with the call to endure faithfully, to hang in there when things get tough. Then, it's coupled with this challenge to actively take up your cross, to embrace the difficulties. And the third principle that guides the whole thing? Simply follow Christ. That's the compass for the whole journey. And here's the crucial thing. This isn't just about saving your own skin. The source really hammers home that believers are called to live for a mission. It's a call to get to work, to be diligent. And to do that, the text says they're given the armor of God, which is this great metaphor for being spiritually protected and ready for action. Okay, so after all that struggle, after the mission, what's the end game? Where does all this lead? This brings us to the grand finale of the disciples' path, the eternal reward. This is the ultimate promise for those who stick with it. And that promise is captured in this incredibly powerful passage from Revelation. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors and their works follow them. What it's basically saying is, the fight will end, you'll get to rest, and everything you did along the way, it matters, eternally. You can really think of the whole journey as this divine exchange. Just look at how it's laid out. It starts with the cross, which is all about the suffering you face right now. But it leads directly to the crown, which represents this incredible future glory. It's the perfect picture of the journey from hardship to reward. So, at the end of the day, what's the ultimate assurance for someone on this path? It really boils down to 3 huge promises: a final, true rest from all the work, the amazing hope of resurrection, and this core belief that, in the end, you will overcome. And so that's the journey from the cross to the crown. The source material kind of leaves us with one last, really personal question to chew on, and it's this: to what mission has Christ called you? It's a great prompt to think about how this path of struggle, mission, and reward might actually play out in your own life.